So, Brian will tell you that I'm quite cantankerous. Actually, I don't think he said that. He said something much worse. But I am quite opinionated. And my daughter says that, says worse. But quite frankly, the one thing that annoys me more than anything about this wonderful industry that we work in is one word: sophisticated. Because we've all heard the term. And typically what sophisticated means, it's a byproduct for, there's nothing we could have done. And, you've seen it before. When any attack happens, typically what happens is we know about the company that's been compromised. And the one thing that everybody is desperate to know is who did it. And we care about who did it, not because we want to learn about their TTPs and share that with the industry so we can actually protect everybody. No, why we care about that is because it's interesting. Or perhaps for the organization to be able to say there's nothing we could have done. This hack was far too difficult for us to stop. I actually think this is complete nonsense. And the reason why I think it is that is because, look, we've all seen charts and graphs like these. In fact, we produced that some time back. But ignoring the fact of that, we see these particular statistics and we hear about these wonderful groups, APT40, Mustang Panda, Fancy Bear. And we wrap this up in this mystery that we've got this, quite frankly, nation-state groups that are going out and carrying out attacks. They're using computers like script kiddies, or they're using attacks like organized crime groups. And we kind of make this assumption that because they are nation states, because they are doing the bidding of government entities, that some way, shape or form, they are more capable than anybody else out there. Now, a few years back, I had a remarkable opportunity to actually observe a nation state group in operation. See, because the great thing about working in the vendor space is I'm no longer a CISO. But the downside of this is that typically what will happen is if there is any breach, if there is any attack, anything that's even remotely successful, typically what happens is we get a phone call and we say, your software didn't stop this, ergo it is entirely your fault. And I will tell you that happens more times than I care to mention. And usually it happens around about Christmas, just as I'm kind of settling in to start eating and watching Polar Express. So a few years back, I got a telephone call from an organization, and they said, look, we've been compromised, and your antivirus software didn't stop this. And I was like, okay, let's have a look at it. And typically, the reason that this happens is because they need somebody to blame. Usually, it's their jobs on the line. Usually it's the CEO or the CIO that's saying, well, why did this happen? And of course, it's much easier to blame the vendor. And so what happened was there was a long-term espionage campaign that we managed to uncover. And all of this was done really to try to determine how the adversaries got in and fundamentally to show the organization and say, hey, look, maybe it wasn't just the technology that was a failure. Perhaps you have to shoulder some of the responsibility as well. That is a very interesting conversation, usually. Now, in this particular case, it was remarkable because as we started to undertake the analysis, what we found was that the adversaries had been in there for 7 years. There was a nation-state group in operation for 7 years. And part of the reason why I think attribution matters, and I'm just going to get to this, is because it was because we were able to attribute this to a nation-state group that finally this got the attention of the CEO. Because before it was just, there's anomalous behavior, there's anomalous traffic, and now all of a sudden it was, there are state secrets that are leaving this organization and have been for 7 years. But of course, we had to address the elephant in the room, which was, why did our antivirus software not stop a nation-state group for 7 years? So that was an interesting discussion because, of course, my first question was, hey, there's been alerts in your environment. Did you not think about responding to them? And the response I got was, yeah, but we get a lot of alerts. I said, okay, well, what did you do with these alerts? Oh, we turned them off. Still your fault, by the way. It's like, yeah, I appreciate that. And then we had to do something remarkable, which actually has never happened to me in my career, because typically, from an incident response perspective, the first thing that you want to do, and the first thing that the client wants you to do, is throw out the adversaries, get them out of my network now. It's reasonable. But the challenge is, and this is the biggest challenge we face, is that in this particular case, and in most particular cases, if there's an adversary in your environment for 7 years, they will establish additional persistence mechanisms. They'll have more backdoors in that particular environment that you probably don't even know about. And so we then had to have a very awkward conversation with the CEO to say, do you mind leaving the actors in the environment? Sorry, did you just say you want to leave threat actors to continually steal, exfiltrate data that are nation secrets and continue to watch them and let them do it? It's like, yeah, that's exactly what we want to do. And I can tell you that, we talk about attribution as a kind of badge of honor, or as a vehicle to be able to say, well, there's nothing we could have done, or perhaps to generate PR and press. But in this particular instance, it was imperative, because this actually allowed this particular organization to acknowledge the fact that they were dealing with pardon the English, but a sophisticated attacker. And by doing so, we were able to identify about 20 to 25 additional backdoors that we hadn't accounted for. And what was even more remarkable was we actually found additional staging servers, and we actually found the data that had been taken and stolen out of this organization. And it became a hugely political issue, because the Prime Minister's office then ended up sending consultants on site to double check our work to make sure we were doing the right thing. But what it gave me, for the first time ever actually, is the opportunity to sit and actively watch nation-state criminals, and not hackers, because that term can't be used for this, but these are criminals working on behalf of a nation-state, stealing information. And for the first time, we actually got to watch how they work. I was actually sitting on their shoulder. And what I realized very quickly is they don't actually work very hard. So those are the hours they worked. I mean, I don't know about you, but that's a pretty decent work-life balance. Because you don't work weekends. And so if you want to work for a nation-state group working out of Southeast Asia, it's only like 5 days a week, and you only need to do a couple of hours now and then. And you just come in and steal some data and then go skiing or whatever you do, right? I kind of realized that actually we're not necessarily dealing with the most, maybe the word is committed, but certainly not the most committed threat actors out there. And of course, when we start to consider the types of threat groups and the types of nation states out there, we kind of make this assumption that, okay, there's only maybe 3 or 4 countries that are actually doing this. I mean, if I was to say to you, which nation state groups are the most active, you would say, I heard of China, I heard of Russia, right? Typically countries that have red flags. But the reality is, and we actually fundamentally got an insight into this market, into this industry, with the hacking team and the Gamma exposures, because the Citizen Lab actually published details of customers of organizations that sell offensive cyber tools. Now, this is the first time that we ever got this. And what we see and what we witness is when we talk about nation states, we make the assumption that they're all sophisticated, but we never really talk about, I don't know, Mongolia as a threat actor group, but they were one of the customers. We never really talk about countries such as Paraguay. And it kind of reminds me of that Lily Allen song, like everybody's doing it, so why aren't we? And the harsh reality is when we talk about nation-state groups, when we talk about sophisticated attackers, everybody is doing it. Genuinely, everybody is doing it. And if you don't have the internal capabilities to develop the code yourself, you can outsource it, and you can buy it from commercial cybersecurity companies. Maybe not cybersecurity companies, but you get the drift, right? You can buy it from commercial companies. Or, as we've learned, you can basically follow security researchers on Twitter and download exploit code and then just run that yourself. And so one of the things that I urge and encourage us as an industry is to move away from like rhetorics like this. And we've all seen this and we've all grown up with this. You know the capability graph where people turn around and say, well, there are script kiddies, and then there are organized criminal gangs, and then you have nation-state groups, and the level of capability goes up and down depending on which bucket you sit in. It's bullshit. And it has been for a while. We need to start to accept the fact that the cybercrime ecosystem is made up of capable technical people that are effectively guns for hire. And whether they're working for nation states or whether they're working for organized crime or whether they're working for ransomware groups, ultimately it's a payday for them. And we've kind of saw that with Operation Tovar a number of years back. You know, so like we have to start to move away from this. And, you know, when we start to think about this, that's part of the reason why we're seeing a level of capability and investment and innovation from ransomware groups really escalate and go through the roof. So you all remember Colonial Pipeline. Colonial Pipeline, of course, was the dark side or black matter ransomware group. And historically, we would have been told, well, you know, these groups are lower or less capable than nation states. And of course, back in the past, ransomware was, well, we'll send an email and somebody will click on it. But actually, if you look at the level of capability and the kill chain that is used by ransomware groups, it is actually really quite capable. So this is the dark side modus operandi. And what we see and what we witness, and this is why security has become so difficult, is the tools that they're using aren't malware per se. They're not, you know, known bad. They're using enterprise tools against you. And the challenge required to protect against these types of attacks is to cut out or is to identify the signal in the noise. If you use RDP in your environment, they do as well. If you're using VNC, they do as well. How do you determine amongst the 27,000 PowerShell, you know, implementations in the environment, the 2 or 3 that have actually got a malicious payload? Much like today, we're seeing the growth and rise in data exfiltration. If you remember a couple of years back when Kaspersky published the Carbonac report, these were attacks against Eastern European banks. And I think the urban myth goes, there was a CISO that actually saw data leaving his environment, and for some reason it was going to China. And he said, oh, that's odd, that shouldn't be going there. And that kind of begun the investigation. That's not happening anymore. The exfiltration of data are using enterprise tools like rClone and sending it to legitimate cloud services. And so if you're filtering or you're looking for, you know, traffic to known malicious C2 infrastructure, that's not happening, because what they're doing is they're using your tools against you. Now, I would argue this is sophisticated. But it doesn't look sophisticated, does it? Because it's not an O-Day, it's not a Pegasus spyware, it's not $100,000 to kind of carry out an attack. What it is, it's using tools that we use every single day against us. And our challenge as an industry is to be able to identify amongst the millions and millions of events that you get a day, the 2 or 3 or 4 that are potentially malicious. And I will tell you, the challenge is that these attacks are only increasing, and the number of alerts that we have in the environment are only increasing. You know, as Dave and Miko have said earlier, the number of systems we have in our own homes are going up, let alone our own environment. You know, remember, I used to give a talk on IoT, and I always used to ask the audience, and I said, how many IoT or how many IP addresses or how many devices do you have in your home? And on average, it was about 20 to 25. I think I'm at about 65 now, most of them in my daughter's bedroom. And there was one guy that put his hand up. He says, I have 250. And I was like, I bet you're single. But that's the challenge. Even in our own homes, the number of devices we have that are going up. And in our own environments, they're going up. And all of these devices are creating alerts. And every single one of those alerts that I've seen, when I get called in to do incidents, are being ignored. And it's not just nation-state attacks. The Soda Nikibi gang carried out an attack against an organization I had to investigate, again blaming me for their failing. And I had to tell them, and I said, well, judging by the investigation, the attackers have been in your environment for 7 months. And they compromised an external RDP server to get in. The response from the CIO was, it's still your fault. I said, all right. You do know the password that you had on your external RDP server was welcome123. His response was, still your fault. And that's the challenge that we face within the industry today. The same tools, the same MITRE attack techniques, the same capabilities that are being used by nation states are being used by ransomware groups. Why? Because it works and because it's successful. It's a darn sight easier to use our clone than it is to send it to establish an infrastructure hosted somewhere shady at a bulletproof hosting site and potentially get blocked. That's the challenge that we're facing within the industry today. And threat actors today, I have to stress, are watching what we do as an industry. The biggest issue we face today is the asymmetry of information. We, as the defenders, publish exploits online. We release stuff on GitHub. We talk about and we release vulnerabilities out there, usually on a Friday night at 4:30. Thank you very much. And the threat actors are out there and they're watching what we do. And we've seen that. We've seen the use of tools. You know, this particular attack was the Microsoft DDE issue. And within 4 weeks of that vulnerability being posted, we actually saw activity from Fancy Bear targeting organizations in Western Europe. They don't need to buy O-Days. They don't need to develop exploits because we do that for them. And there is no way that we're going to get around it because we need our followers, especially now that we're on Mastodon and we have nothing and we're starting from zero. But that's the reality. That's the reality of the situation that we have, is there is this asymmetry of information. And so my ask of all of us today is simple. When we start to think about attribution, when we start to think about who's actually behind the attacks, and we've heard about data sharing, we've heard about information sharing. First of all, if we're going to be sharing information, let's make it actionable. Let's make it usable. If we're going to be talking about threat actors, let's start to share the TTPs that are used by the groups. Right? Because this sounds crazy, but many of these threat groups and these APT groups do have not necessarily a signature set, but they do have an MO. Moreover, if we're going to be sharing information, let's talk about the tools that they're using. And if you're going to be using an MDR provider, if you're going to be using a cybersecurity company, talk to them about the fact and say, hey, look, we don't use Mimikatz in our environment for red teaming. So if you see that in the network, you can block it as part of the onboarding. And IOCs, let's actively start to share this information amongst us as an industry, and let's make it more difficult for them. You might recall a couple of years back, there was these, DDoS extortion tactics, and they were going after the UK financial sector. And they went after Bank 1, Bank 2, Bank 3, and Bank 4, using the same MO, the same tactics. That can be stopped if we're just a little bit more open about what we share and the timeliness of sharing that. Thank you very much. Any time, or did you want to? It's okay.
Hey, how's it going? Very good talk there.
Thank you.
Just a quick one in regards to the deep harvest aspect. So you've found additional 25 back doors there. And obviously you were noticing that they weren't really monitoring inside the environment. When you started closing those back doors, was there an influx of activity or?
Yeah, so actually we had to plan what we call a strike day. And so one weekend, what we had to do was we had to effectively bring everybody on site. We had to do a Kerberos golden ticket reset because we were concerned that they had completely pwned the Active Directory environment. We identified those back doors. And then that one day, everything was shut. Because the challenge was, and if you remember, I think it was the Bank of Taiwan heist, where they used Hermes ransomware to cover their track. What we were concerned about was, if they knew that we were onto them, they were going to burn the environment. So the strike day had to be coordinated in a way that we closed everything off, shut them out as quickly as we could, and then monitor the environment to make sure that we hadn't missed anything. But yeah, that was a very, very stressful weekend.
I can imagine. And did you see any activity of them trying to get back in, or was it just once it was closed, they kind of just gave up?
Well, I haven't named the customer, so I haven't named the organization, so I can say that we hadn't seen them go back. And then all of the work that we said, well, once this is done, we're then going to go through an exercise with you around rebuilding your environment, strengthening your security, and you're going to have to do investment. They said, yeah, thanks, we'll get back to you. So I expect a call, but I don't know when it's going to happen. But yeah, as far as they were concerned, it was fine. But what was interesting was we actually got the IOCs, and then we tracked the prevalence of the campaign across the globe because obviously we had like global telemetry. And the campaign that we saw wasn't just directed at that one organization. It was actually a global campaign against defense contractors all across Asia and Western Europe. So they're still active and the same tools were being used. But we published all of the IOCs and made it available to all of our competitors as well.
Perfect. Thank you.
No worries.
I think you've got one more.
Hi there. You mentioned that adversaries are using more living off the land and cloud infrastructure. Does that imply then that attribution is getting harder over time, or are we just moving on to different methods?
That's a great question. Attribution with technical indicators is a fool's errand. And so we're actually reevaluating our attribution policy, but what we can do is we can use that earlier pyramid and start to indicate or have confidence indicators as to who we believe to be behind that. One thing that we've made a decision on is we won't actually say it was country A or country B. We say a level of confidence and the likely threat group behind it. You know, we're not law enforcement. We're not the government. We're not here to point fingers at countries. What we are there to do, though, is reveal the methodologies that we believe specific threat groups are using and share that methodology with the industry. So, yeah, we're quite circumspect about it for that reason. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you.